So in this talk, I will be discussing whether explanatory gaps are sparse or abundant in nature. I will try to motivate the idea about what an explanatory gap is, and to give a somewhat rigorous definition of an explanatory gap. And I will eventually give special attention to the case of consciousness, to the most famous explanatory gap from the philosophy of mind, which is the one that involves consciousness. And I will try to argue that no matter whether explanatory gaps are sparse or abundant, this explanatory gap is especially significant. So I first want to start by motivating the idea of explanatory gaps by introducing this plausible intuition that reality itself doesn't have explanatory gaps, that mainly reality is intelligible. So if we look around us in macroscopic reality, there seem to be a lot of examples of composition where if we analyze an entity in terms of its part or in terms of it as a whole, as a composite made of those parts, there seems to be a clear and intelligible connection between the parts and the entity as a composite made of those parts. So like if you take a castle brick built out of Lego bricks and you analyze that castle at the level of the Lego bricks, which are arranged in such and such a structure, and then you analyze it at the level of the castle itself, there seems to be an intelligible connection between the two. And there are many, many examples like this everywhere around us. Mainly any entity, any object around us at the macroscopic level, if you analyze it in terms of its parts and you analyze it in terms of the object itself, the parts and the object seem connected. It seems pretty clear how the two are connected, how the parts arranged in such and such a way give rise to that object as a composite. And if we take that idea all the way, we reach to this stronger thesis, which here I call intelligibility with a capital I, which mainly says that for a sufficiently powerful intellect, so something like God or Laplace's demon or whatever you want your example of some ideal intellect to be, that all connections, not just this connection at the macroscopic level, but that all connections from the more to the less fundamental aspects of reality are intelligible. So if this thesis, intelligibility, is true, in principle, it is intelligible how the fundamental states constitute everything non-fundamental. This is a drawing of Laplace's demon. I found it on Google Images. I don't know if it's accurate, probably not. Anyway, so a more rigorous way to understand what is going on and what is going on in intelligibility, in the thesis of intelligibility, and how it connects to metaphysics is by introducing this notion of grounding. So grounding, as I understand it, is a metaphysical relation of directed dependence that holds between grounds, which correspond to some more fundamental facts, and groundees, which correspond to less fundamental facts. So grounding is about metaphysics, while intelligibility is about epistemology. And so grounding tells us how facts in the world, in reality itself, are metaphysically connected, how reality itself is metaphysically structured. On the other hand, intelligibility is about our understanding of these connections. And if intelligibility is true, from it follows that all grounding connections are intelligible. Anytime you have a ground and a groundie, if you're Laplace's demon or God or some other similar being, that connection should be intelligible. And before we go forward, I would like to just introduce one more definition, and that is a more rigorous definition of this concept of an intelligible connection. So maybe that's intuitively plausible, but we can also define it a little bit more rigorously as a priori entailment. And I stole this definition from Chalmers and Jackson. I will come back to them in a few slides, but what this means mainly is that if you have two truths, two propositions, A and B, you can say that the first one, so proposition A priori entails the second one, so B, if and only if the material implication A implies B is a priori knowable. You can know it a priori. So what that means is, if you have proposition A and you have proposition B, and that's all the information that you have, you can a priori, without any further information, just based on the information that is available to you in those two propositions, figure out that it's absolutely impossible for A to be true while B to be false. So if A is true, B must also be true. So that's what's meant by an intelligible connection more rigorously. It's a priori entailment understood in that way. Now, with these tools in hand, we can move on to physicalism, which is mainly the metaphysical thesis that many contemporary philosophers believe in. So physicalism is the idea that all the fundamental facts are physical facts, and that these fundamental physical facts ground all the other facts. So that's a definition of physicalism in terms of grounding. And if we add intelligibility to the mix, if we take both intelligibility and physicalism to be true, then we also get this epistemic idea that these fundamental physical facts that are posited by physicalists not only ground all the other facts, but also that there's this intelligible connection between them, that there's this a priori entailment between the fundamental physical facts and everything else, all the other facts. However, as you probably know, physicalism faces at least one big bad bug, and that is consciousness. So that's consciousness making a very dramatic entrance. So you have David Chalmers, Philip Goff, Frank Jackson, although he changed his mind and now he's actually a physicalist. So yeah, that's Philip here, that's David Chalmers, that's Frank Jackson on top. So all these philosophers have argued very influentially that physicalism is false due to an explanatory gap which involves consciousness. Sorry. So we can define this explanatory gap. I call it here consciousness gap, as the thesis that there is no a priori entailment between the physical truths and at least some of the consciousness truths. And this kind of this idea of consciousness gap is in various forms is the key premise in the so-called epistemic arguments against physicalism, the conceivability argument, the knowledge argument, the explanatory gap argument, the revelation argument. So these philosophers have given forms of some of these arguments, and there are other philosophers who have given others. But yeah, all of these arguments are mainly making the same point, which is that mainly there is no intelligible connection between the fundamental physical facts and the facts of consciousness, and that if such a connection is lacking, physicalism is false. And we can present that graphically like this. You have the physical facts, or rather the fundamental physical facts, you have the consciousness facts as putative groundees, but if consciousness gap is true, there's no a priori entailment. And this puts doubt on the claim that the physical facts are actually grounding the consciousness facts. So if consciousness gap is true, the connection between the physical truths and the truths of consciousness would be unintelligible, even to God. And according to many anti-physicalists, this lack of intelligibility is evidence that the physical facts do not ground the consciousness facts. If so, physicalism is false. So what I was trying to show here is how this idea of intelligibility connects with physicalism, with our metaphysical assumptions, to show us that explanatory gaps can be a guide to reality, to the metaphysical structure of the world. That if you encounter an explanatory gap, like in the case of the consciousness gap, this might be evidence that something has gone wrong with our metaphysical theorizing about the world. And given all of this, a more general concept of an explanatory gap can be defined in terms of grounding as follows. So for any ground P and a ground Q, I use this notation here with the square brackets to indicate facts. So for any ground P and ground Q, P and Q exhibit an explanatory gap if the P truths, so the truths of the ground, do not a priori entail the Q truths, so the truths of the groundie. So if the ground truths do not a priori entail the groundie truths, then you have an explanatory gap. And given the previous thesis of intelligibility, there should be no explanatory gaps in grounding connections. Therefore, if you encounter an explanatory gap, this is evidence that the grounding claim you're making is likely false, that you're mistaken to think that that ground is the ground of such and such groundee. So if all of this is true, if all of this is plausible, or at least plausible, there's good reason to think that explanatory gaps are a guide to reality, are a guide to metaphysics. If you encounter an explanatory gap, that's a reason to maybe rethink the metaphysical assumptions you are making. And as anti-physicalists have argued, it is a reason to think that physicalism is false. But not everybody agrees. In contrast to all of this, to this whole picture, recently you have Jonathan Schaffer positing this new version of physicalism, which he calls ground functionalism, where explanatory gaps are everywhere, in all grounding connections between concrete entities. So Schaffer, for one, doesn't think that the consciousness gap is metaphysically significant, doesn't think it has metaphysical implications, but moreover rejects the thesis of intelligibility in general. According to Schaffer, no explanatory gap is a guide to what grounds what. So it's a very, very different picture than all the previous, and all the arguments in the philosophy of mind and any similar argument like that does not work in this picture that Jonathan Schaffer has defended. So before going to the details of how Jonathan Schaffer justifies ground functionalism, I will just give like a bird's eye overview of his theory of ground functionalism. So you have at the bottom level, at the fundamental level, the fundamental physical entities, and just like all physicalists, he also thinks that consciousness is grounded in them. However, like a lot of anti-physicalists, he agrees that there's an explanatory gap. He's happy to accept that there's an explanatory gap between the fundamental physical entities and consciousness. However, there's more. He says the same thing about all macroscopic entities in general. So everything you can see around us, so tables, chairs, buildings, people, whatever you want. Again, he says, there's an explanatory gap there. There are explanatory gaps between the fundamental physical entities and all of these macroscopic entities. And in general, between all other groundees and the fundamental physical entities, we have an explanatory gap. In any case of grounding involving concrete entities, there's an explanatory gap. Okay, you might think, if you bought into that first intuition I was presenting at the very beginning, that like when you look at a Lego brick castle and you try to analyze it at the level of the Lego bricks and at the level of the castle itself, and I said clearly the connection here is intelligible, you might say, how can Schaffer argue for this? Well, his main argument for it comes from debates in mereology, which is mainly the philosophical discipline investigating questions of the relation between parts and composite, parts and wholes. So Van in Wagen has started an important debate there in mereology, and this debate revolves around the question of when and if at all parts compose a further entity. So if you look at this box to the left, there are two objects there, object A and object B. And these objects are touching. And if we ask this question, and we can ask the question of how many objects are there in the box? Is it just the objects A and B, or do they also compose a third object, some composite object that is made of them but is somehow beyond them? And if we look at the debates on this question, it seems that the question doesn't really have a clear answer. There are mainly two options. One is the option of the mereological nihilist, who likes to say that they're just two objects. It doesn't matter that they're touching. There's object A, there's object B, and they don't really compose anything extra. On the other hand, you have the mereological universalist who says, look, there are three objects. There's object A, there's object B, and then there's this composite object that's made from them, but is somehow also an addition to them. And this question doesn't seem to have a clear answer. If you buy into the debate, both options have arguments for them, and both options seem somewhat plausible and at least do not seem as something that can be a priori dismissed. And it doesn't seem that one option is a priori certain while the other is a priori false. So Schaffer uses the existence of this debate to say that there is this ubiquitous explanatory gap, which involves composition. So the previous question is non-trivial. The question of composition is non-trivial. There's an open debate about it. And he says, look, every time you have some grounds grounding a composite, potentially grounding a composite, for any set of entities, E1, E2, up to En, whatever, the truths about these entities do not a priori entail truths about the existence of composite. So if you have a set of entities, nothing in them can tell you whether there's also a composite or not. So you can't have this kind of an intelligible connection that's needed according to intelligibility in a grounding connection when it comes to composition, simply because we don't have an a priori answer to this question of how many entities there are, not necessarily in this box, but in some potential example of parts composing a whole. So Schaffer uses that to say, look, there's composition everywhere, therefore there's an explanatory gap everywhere. And there, I call that gap this mereological gap. And he uses this mereological gap to mainly negate the thesis of intelligibility and to say explanatory gaps are everywhere. We don't know whether parts composed wholes or not. Here is a very clear passage where he says that, where he expresses that idea. He says, I'm saying that an ideal mind, given the empirical information that there are HH and O atoms in a given arrangement, and given the conceptual information that an H2O molecule is an individual composed in a given way and with a given nature, still needs more information to determine whether an H2O molecule is present. She needs substantive metaphysical information about the principles of composition. So mainly, even if you know that there are some entities in some arrangement, and even if you know that these entities have, and even if you have full information about potential composite that they might be giving rise to, you still don't know whether they actually do give rise to that composite or not. Does that composite exist or not? That's the idea that he's expressing here. In contrast to him, as I already said at the beginning, in the philosophy of mind, and I think in philosophy in general, both physicalists and anti-physicalists accept intelligibility because mainly they reject this so-called mereological gap. A lot of people think that for any ground and any macroscopic ground it might have, the truths of that ground a priori entail the truths of that ground. So when it comes to macroscopic entities, at least, like things like buildings, cats, here I'm understanding macroscopic a little bit broadly, molecules, like in SCHAFFER'S example, apples, bicycles, mountains, whatever. They say that there is this clear intelligible connection, and they use this idea of macroscopic intelligibility to justify intelligibility in general. So every time you have a ground and you have a macroscopic groundie, a lot of people want to say that there is a clear intelligible connection between them. So what is going on here? How can there be this deep disagreement? How can, on one hand, people who support intelligibility be saying that there are no explanatory gaps in all these cases, and on the other hand, you have Schaffer saying that there clearly are explanatory gaps everywhere? And my diagnosis of this dispute is that, well, they are mainly talking past each other because they're starting with different assumptions and conceiving of the groundies in two very different ways. And I try to elucidate this disagreement by introducing these notions of strong and weak groundies. So on the one hand, you have Schaffer, who I think is conceiving of concrete groundies as what I call strong groundies. So an entity E is a strong groundie if and only if it is, one, it's non-fundamental, which mainly means it's a groundie, and two, it's something over and above its ground. So there's something more to it. It's not just its ground, there's something more to it. On the other hand, the friends of macroscopic intelligibility do the opposite. They conceive of concrete groundies as what I call weak groundies. And an entity E is a weak groundie if, one, it is a groundie, it's unfundamental, and it's nothing over and above its ground. So there's nothing more to it than what's already contained in the ground. And I think there's a lot of evidence in the even though this is not really explicitly discussed, I think there's a lot of evidence in the way these authors speak when they discuss explanatory gaps of the involved entities that I think really justifies this division and classification. So Schaffer, throughout his career, has defended what he calls a robust realism for the non-fundamental. He takes entities like tables to be full-blown, what he calls heavyweight entities, on the roster of entities. In his view, both the fundamental and the derivative entities exist equally in the one and only sense of exist. Moreover, he says, I agree with the anti-physicalist that the phenomenal information is extra information. My point is that the same holds for all other higher level information. So I think all of this indicates that he does think of grounds as something over and above their grounds. On the other hand, when you look at Chalmers, for example, he says that the derivative facts are a redescription of the fundamental facts. He says once God, hypothetically, made sure that all the physical facts in our world held, the biological facts came along for free. The B facts, so these B facts are some higher level facts, merely redescribe what is described by the A facts, which are some more fundamental facts. They may be different facts. A fact about elephants is not a microphysical fact, but they're not further facts. So I think this quite clearly shows that Schaffer doesn't, that Chalmers, unlike Schaffer, doesn't think that the higher level facts are something more than the lower level facts. He says they're different, but they're not further. And Goff, more recently, says something very similar. He has this idea of grounding by analysis, and he says that when it comes to macroscopic entities, at least, they clearly are nothing over and above their ground. And he illustrates this with party as an example. He says, it's not as though there are people drinking, dancing, and dancing, drinking, and so on. And then there's this extra thing, the party, that floats above their heads. There's a very intuitive sense in which the fact that there is a party is nothing more than the fact that there are people reveling. A world in which there are people reveling is already thereby a world in which there is a party. So again, I think this clearly contrasts with what Schaffer was saying previously. And what's interesting is that neither side really defends this presupposition, but they both make a presupposition, and they make a different presupposition about the ground is. So Schaffer, in MEREOLOGICAL gap, presupposes strong ground is. On the other hand, Goff and Chalmers presuppose weak ground is in their idea of well, the lack of explanatory gaps in reality. So we can say that MEREOLOGICAL gap requires strong ground is, while macrophysical intelligibility requires weak ground is. However, if so, even if we don't pick a side, that means that if people like Chalmers and Goff are right, and the macroscopic groundies are weak groundies, then MEREOLOGICAL gap nor ground functionalism can get off the ground. If we make that assumption, if we make that presupposition, namely that groundies are weak groundies, then Schaffer's argument cannot even start. But if we start with the other assumption, then of course we have this MEREOLOGICAL gap. We have explanatory gaps in all cases of MEREOLOGICAL composition. So that's a diagnosis, and this diagnosis leads us to the following metaphysical view, which I call lightweightism. So if we suppose that all concrete groundies are weak groundies, then it's also reasonable to suppose that there are no explanatory gaps between their grounds, between grounds and their weak groundies. And if we go with this kind of a picture with lightweightism, then the anti-physicalist arguments and similar explanatory gap arguments do have a bite. can be a guide to reality. So we can argue for anti-physicalism if this is the right picture. However, Schaffer rejects all of this. He accepts another view. So a question arises, even though this lightweight view seems to be the orthodoxy among contemporary anti-physicalists, what if Schaffer is right? And what if it's a mistaken view? What if Schaffer's presupposition about groundees being strong groundees is the right one? What if something like this is true, what I call here heavyweightism? It's a picture where all the concrete groundees are strong groundees, and there are explanatory gaps everywhere between all grounds and their strong groundees. Well, I want to say, even if so, we can still argue against physicalism with the consciousness gap. Not only if lightweightism is true, but even if heavyweightism is true. And this is because this explanatory gap, the consciousness explanatory gap, is especially opaque. It's especially mysterious, what I call deeply opaque, and therefore demands an explanation. So it's like this black hole pictured here. So what do I mean by this deep opacity? Well, I will try here to give a general definition of it. So if you have any ground P and a ground Q, there's a deeply opaque explanatory gap between them, if and only if. Well, number one, you need to conceive them under concepts that reveal their full essence. So I didn't really speak about this previously, but maybe I should have, that in general, when we are dealing with epistemic matters like explanatory gaps as a guide to reality, we should be conceiving of the facts or the entities that we are investigating in the proper way. Otherwise, we might get explanatory gaps because of our epistemic limitations or lack of information. So we should conceive of them in the proper way. That's what this requirement says. And in general, when people discuss these matters, they always had some kind of a qualification that takes care of this requirement. So this shouldn't be controversial. The second one is that there is an explanatory gap between the ground and the groundee. Again, this is clear. For a gap to be deeply opaque, it has to be an explanatory gap to begin with. That's mainly what this condition is saying. Now comes the important bit. So, a priori reflection on the groundie, on Q, reveals the condition for being a ground of Q. So, and I will come back to this, and I think there's a very strong inductive justification of this condition. But mainly the idea here is that every time you have a groundie conceived in the right way, and you analyze that concept, you encounter a certain condition that's contained in the groundie, in the concept of the groundie, which mainly tells you what kind of things can be its grounds. What something needs to be like to be a ground of that groundie. And the final condition is that the ground, the putative ground, does not fulfill this condition. So you look at the groundie, you look at Q, and you discover what are the limitations that any possible ground it may have must fulfill. And then you look at the putative ground and you see that it doesn't fulfill this condition. So it's completely mysterious, even with the existence of a regular explanatory gap between them, how these two facts are connected metaphysically. I will try now to explain this with some examples. So before going to them, just to say again, according to this, consciousness gap is deeply opaque, while mereological gap is not. So what do I mean by it? Well, let's take SCHAFFER'S example with the H2O molecule and the atoms grounding it. So if you look at the molecule and analyze it, analyze the concept of it, well, an H2O molecule already contains information about HNO atoms being arranged in such and such a structure. So even if we are in this heavyweight framework where the molecule is something more than the atoms, the molecule does contain the necessary structure that the atoms fulfill in order to ground it. So even if there's more to the molecule than just the atoms in such and such a structure, there's still a very strong and intelligible connection between the two, despite there being a gap between them in the heavyweight framework. And I think this generalizes to any other example of a molecule or chemical or biological or macroscopic object in general. Another example, a bicycle. You analyze a bicycle, it tells you for something to be a bicycle, it has to have such and such a structure. Well, a ground of a bicycle, you could say, are atoms arranged bike-wise, arranged in a bicycle-like structure. But again, the groundie already tells you what that structure is like that must be satisfied by any potential ground it may have. So again, even if the bicycle in a heavyweight framework is something more than the atoms arranged bike-wise, there's still a clear connection between them. So the gap cannot be deeply opaque. However, now we arrive at consciousness. This is supposed to represent the experience of blue, of blueness. So you analyze that experience, the phenomenal concept of that experience, the phenomenal concept of blue, you don't really find any condition that something like a brain or any arrangement of physical entities is able to fulfill. You just find experience. You find some qualitative nature that might even be impossible to express verbally. Just feels a certain way, feels blue. That's all there is to that concept. And it's similar to many, if not all, experiences. So in this case, there's something very different going on than in these other cases. And that's why I like to say that the case of consciousness is deeply opaque. Even in this heavyweight framework, it's more mysterious. And my idea is that, well, deep opacity needs an explanation. Anti-physicalists can reasonably argue that the deep opacity of the consciousness gap entails that physicalism is false, even if heavyweightism is true. Therefore, ground physicalism is false. And the onus is on the ground functionalist to explain the deep opacity of the consciousness gap. So, in conclusion, anti-physicalists can accept macroscopic intelligibility and lightweightism. Then everything goes smoothly. The regular arguments against physicalism work as well as you can expect them to work. At least SCHAFFER'S criticism of them doesn't arise. Or they can accept MEREOLOGICAL gap and heavyweightism. In either case, the consciousness explanatory gap remains special. Well, that's all. So thank you very much for listening.